Everyone hear me? Thanks, Malik. Good morning, everyone. So I'll start out by saying, if I mention global warming, you can throw tomatoes at me. I'll try to just keep it to climate, because a day like this, and having just finished my delicious bowl of ice cream, talking about warming would be a faux pas. Obviously, we're looking at the new museum, and so I'm going to tell you a story this morning in 3 parts. And the first part is going to be a little bit about me and my past life at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. I'm a geneticist by training, but as I transitioned to direct that institute, thinking about climate change became ever more important. And what you're seeing here, obviously, is a ship passing through the Panama Canal. You know, if Rachel Silverstein were in the audience, she would be cursing this picture because, of course, Florida, and Miami particularly, is dredging for the new port to take the post-Panamax vessels that will go through the new Panama Canal, and it's destroying corals off our coast. So there's a connection here, but I was initially attracted to the Panama Canal and opportunities there because this canal represents almost 5% of global commerce. And my feeling is if you want to bring attention to changing climate, or more generally, how we interact with our environment, doing it through commerce gets the attention of a certain portion of our society in ways that otherwise we're less fortunate to do. So 5% of global commerce going through this canal. And I had the opportunity to work with a couple of donors. We bought about 1,000 hectares of property in the canal watershed and started what's the largest landscape experiment going on in the tropics. And in part 3 of my story, I'm going to come back to the tropics, because here in Miami, in the subtropics, we're on that edge, and that's an important edge to be on, which I'll get to later. But I don't think I'd be a scientist. Ooh, that didn't come out. That's okay. I can explain it anyways. I figured that I had to show you a little bit of data and run you through it. So actually what you're looking at here obviously are 2 lines, and if you had the axis on the bottom, you'd be just looking at the months of the year. So many of you, because you live in Miami, understand something about tropical seasonality. We get most of our rain from about April, May, coming all the way through September, October, and peaking November, December. On this axis, you're looking at actual rainfall or overland water. And this is water coming into the Panama Canal. And it's interesting to me. I got really fascinated by this because the World Bank came to Panama and talked about what Panama needed to do to ensure water for the Panama Canal. I think you're probably mostly aware that the Panama Canal operates on fresh water. It's a gravity-fed system. And that's one of the things that makes it economic. So obviously having water is important. The World Bank, though, just looks at water like water. Okay, well, you know, you get 4 meters of rain a year in Panama. That should be sufficient to run the canal. If we actually pave the 300,000 hectares of the Panama Canal, we'd maximize the amount of water that we could actually gain for the canal. We can just do that. What completely overlooks what you're seeing on this graph, which is that rainfall is, precipitation varies across the year. Lots of rain, no rain. So guess when the Panama Canal is at risk? It's at risk during this time of the year, and this is the sort of thing that will become exacerbated under climate change with changing rainfall patterns. Well, so now the part I haven't told you is that the red line follows water coming off a deforested watershed, okay? Very few trees on it. The yellow line is water coming off a 50% deforested, so not even a fully forested watershed. And what you're seeing at this time of the year when water is critical for the Panama Canal, it's the forested watershed that's returning more water to the Panama Canal. That's critically important. Remember, 5% of global commerce. We had an El Nino event in 97, 98, which is a drying event in Panama, where water levels in the lake got so low that ships going through had to reduce their draft. In other words, they had to leave China with less load on, or they had to get to Panama and offload before they could go through the Panama Canal. This is the sort of thing that will become exacerbated under changing rainfall patterns expected in that variation between El Nino, La Nina. But for me, what's interesting about this is just the reminder that we invest heavily in science, and we invest heavily in scientists like myself. I mean, my entire education was paid for by, if not your tax dollars, your parents' tax dollars, and there should be a return on that investment. So we have a lot of good information out there about the potential impacts of environmental change generally on things like commerce, on the services that we take for granted that come from nature. But we don't pay enough attention to that. And as I moved out of the lab into the administration at the Smithsonian, I became more and more interested in how you pull science into action much more quickly than has been the tradition. And I really thought that the Frost Science Museum provided a tremendous opportunity. One, because obviously it's this magnificent new museum going up. Two, because we have people like Jillian, who's really thought over an incredibly long career about how you bring science to people. And that was very, very important to me. But also because of Miami. This is really a spectacular opportunity to think about how changing climate is going to impact all of us by a number of measures. We have a very special place, and that will be part 3, really, of today's story. So part 2 of today's story, I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but I wanted to ensure that was the fact by bringing it to your attention. This is risky business. This was published in 2014, and I think it's interesting because of the people that were behind it, which was principally Mayor Bloomberg, Dennis Paulson, who was the Treasury Secretary under Bush, and Tom Steyer, who many of you will perhaps be aware of because he tried to play a very key role in the Florida governor's election. He put a lot of money into Florida because he is very, very concerned about climate. And he wanted to have an impact on any state where he felt we were trying to elect somebody that was simply unaware or not focusing enough attention on climate. So they put this together, which is really an economic analysis of climate. And as no surprise, Florida is really ground zero for the impacts of changing climate. And you see here, a lot of that owes obviously to the potential impact on property values. Any of you who live on the beach or near the beach can imagine, many of those buildings are within, will be below mean sea level by 2030, an even larger group will be below sea level in 2050. And you can see here, you can see here the potential cost, 2030, right? So we're talking 15 years from now. And this is a 1 in 20 chance, but this is a 67% chance there. $69.2 billion worth of property losses. People start to think about this. So this is doom and gloom, right? Which is not what the Science Museum is really about. Let's look at another example. Average summer temperature. And you can just, if you read in the bottom here, you can see associated with this average increase in summer temperature, we're going to have a lot of deaths, we're going to have reduced productivity, we're going to have increased disease potential, lots of changes. This is Florida. This is Florida. So this is the place in the United States which has to play a strong role in how we respond to changing climate. This is where it's really happening in the States. And people are aware of it because of the economic impacts. Now, what risky business doesn't really talk about, and this is what risky business doesn't really talk about are other impacts. So yesterday, some of you were here, and we had this incredible announcement in the morning. Dr. Ted Kaplow announced his Inventors in Residence, or CAPSI Inventors, that will be put into the new museum. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in part 3 of this story, the role that the museum needs to play in innovation. But Ted really started it off, and I'm only going to talk about one of the 2 prizes that he announced, and that's the prize for restoring coral reefs anywhere in the world, but particularly in the Caribbean, where we've lost 80% of our coral cover in the last 4 decades. That's remarkable when you think about it. Now, a lot of that there's a whole variety of factors that play into that. One of them is definitely global warming, increased temperatures. Corals are living really at their physiological limit, and you do slight changes, increasing temperature, increasing nitrogen, increasing phosphorus, and they react poorly to that. But nothing endangers corals as much as ocean acidification. Risky business doesn't talk about that with regard to South Florida. Andrew Baker, who was on the panel yesterday during the prize announcement, pointed out that in South Florida, there's $6 billion worth of revenue that's sort of associated in one way or the other with coral reefs, either diving or fishing or that sort of thing. So that's a tremendous impact. And what I think is cool about Ted's prize is the innovation aspect of it. And I think this is the sort of thing that the museum can bring to life. So here, and this is part 3 of the story, this is the Innovation Center at the new museum. Some of you I see in the audience have actually walked the site with me, and you know a little bit about the history of the Innovation Center, and you know, for the rest of you, there's an opportunity still. We're about a little over a year from opening the museum. There's still tremendous opportunity to think about how this Innovation Center will come to life. Ted's prize and the 2 inventors in residence that it will promote will be on one of the floors in the Innovation Center. And I think it points to an incredible opportunity for Miami, for South Florida, to innovate in this area of the environment with regard to climate change. When I first arrived here a little less than a year ago, one of the first things I did is I went to Startup Cities Miami, and I listened to Richard Florida and a number of other people. And it was amazing to me. I mean, everybody was talking about Boston, Silicon Valley. It's where the great universities are. And almost nobody in all of the presenters really talked about Miami or South Florida and the particular opportunities that we have here to provide information to the rest of the world about the impacts of changing climate, but not the doom and gloom. I mean, that's there, anybody can look at it, but when you read the Risky Business Report, what they point out is that they've done all their calculations based on business as usual. So what that means is that we're continuing to increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at the current rates. But they point out that through behavior change, which is something that this museum should do, it should change all of our behaviors and the behaviors of our kids and the behaviors of our visitors. Through behavior change, we can obviously begin to decrease pollution particularly and its impact. And at the same time, we can begin to adapt to the changes that are already coming. Both of those things will reduce risk. Right? And that's what this museum should be about. It should be about reducing risk, not only here in South Florida, but for the world. And that's part 3 of my story, is the role that this museum, I think, can play not only in South Florida, but globally as a beacon for change, for innovation in the way that we interact with our environment. This is a great picture. This is the Gulf Stream Aquarium, 510,000 gallons. And you can just imagine that as you're sitting on the vista level of the new museum and you're looking out, you can sort of imagine a couple of worlds. You're looking out at South Beach, and you can imagine that becoming inundated, and whether or not, like Mary Mattingly, who's an artist, would say, well, if that happens, we'll all move to ships. She doesn't really have, she doesn't really have, I can let that go. She doesn't really have a cruise liner in mind. She's invented this really cool little barge, very reminiscent of what Natalie and Ted are trying to do on the science barge, but in a different way. So she imagines, well, we may all have to just live at sea as sea level comes up. but actually risky business. And I think many of us in this room think, no, we can figure out ways to adapt to changing climate and innovate. And the center should be this. So this is the last part. This is a slide that I stole from a TED talk that I gave a couple of years ago, where the focus was slightly different, but I think it tells an important story that many people overlook, which is that really the world's great universities and the world's great museums are in the North Temperate Zone. That's just a fact. It's starting to change, but that's really where it is. And any of you who are scientists, but even if you're not a scientist, if you're a painter or an artist, most of us do our best work in our own backyard. And so the point I made with this slide in the TED Talk is that, if the great universities are in the north and the biodiversity is in the south, there's a mismatch. There's a bunch of us like myself who migrated south to study that biodiversity, but we're definitely a minority. And I think the last thing that I want to say about this museum is we are in the subtropics. And that one of the reasons that lunch with Malik went on for so long is he introduced me to a book called Nature's Metropolis, Chicago and the Great West. It's an economic and ecological history of Chicago in the 19th century, and really talks about what made Chicago great. And it wasn't Chicago on its own, it was Chicago and its relationship to the Great West. And I think you all know that Miami has a very similar relationship with the Caribbean and Latin America. And I really see Miami as a 21st century Chicago. The book is wonderful. It's by William Cronin, if you want to read it. It will give you lots of insights about where Miami might go. But I think that the frost science can play a transformative role in the relationship of Miami to the greater region and beyond. I don't want to only focus on the Caribbean and Latin America. I think that's a particularly sweet spot for us, but as well Africa. I think there's plenty that we can do there because we have in Miami, we have the resources, both human and financial, to make differences in the way that we invent, innovate, think about our own interaction with the environment. And it's a tremendous opportunity, and I think it's one that frost science is poised to play an incredibly strong role. And with that, I think, before I end, I wanted to say one thing. We have a visitor from the Minneapolis Museum of Science, and Patrick, who's sitting here in the front row. He's done an absolute, and I know after we get up, people will be lingering. I'd like to invite people to introduce themselves to Patrick. So Patrick, I was introduced to Patrick just about a year ago, and he's played an amazing role in Minneapolis in thinking about climate. And he starts globally, he moves to the state, he then moves to the city, and he's done some wonderful things, just pointing out what cities can do in terms of thinking about differences in the heat. So in the urban areas versus the slightly suburban areas, and then all the way to the Minnesota Museum of Science and the building itself. So he's a resource. He's here visiting us just for the weekend, and if anybody wants to talk, I just wanted to make sure that you were recognized, Patrick. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions or anything else.
Do we have any questions?